I had heard about I Am Not Spock growing up as a Star Trek fan as this angry memoir in which Leonard Nimoy tries to distance himself from Trek and the beloved character he portrayed and convince fans in Hollywood that he's his own person and he should be allowed to have a life after Spock. Like Shatner once said, get a life. I didn't read it for the longest time because I was afraid it would affect my respect and admiration for the man. I even read his 90s follow-up memoir, I Am Spock, which read like an apology for the original, but only because I hadn't read that yet. I was somewhat disillusioned with Gene Roddenberry when I did a research project on his life in high school. I read a biography that discussed his promiscuous behavior that led to his divorce and then his remarrying Majel Barrett, and it was the first time someone I envisioned as a perfect role model, a brilliant and godlike visionary, became a human being. I imagine Zefram Cochrane in Star Trek First Contact is somewhat inspired by Roddenberry's history. I just wasn't keen on that happening for me with Leonard Nimoy as well. A friend of mine recommended I finally sit down and read the book in 2008, assuring me it wasn't at all like the rumors I'd heard. She lent it to me, and I was instantly enthralled with the book, read it cover to cover over a couple afternoons, and I couldn't fathom how those rumors ever got started. Like with so many things, I think fans just reacted to what sounded like a negative title, and few to nobody who said that actually sat down and read it. I don't know how you could even get that from the cover. I mean, look at it. It's a drawing of Spock, not Nimoy, and it's not like it has a big slash through it like the Ghostbusters symbol. There's actually a lot of Nimoy in that cover. He created the Vulcan hand sign, and of course, you wouldn't have Spock if it weren't for all the things that Leonard Nimoy brought to it. The book was written in 1975, during a positive, even blissful period in Nimoy's life. He had recently played T'Vee in a traveling stage production of Fiddler on the Roof, one of his most gratifying jobs as an actor, and had spent some time rediscovering himself after Star Trek. This was before he had established himself as a photographer or a director, though he discusses his passion from childhood for the former and his intense curiosity about the latter, which would be satiated beyond directing television episodes when he would direct Star Trek 3 and 4, and then the comedy hit 3 Men and a Baby in 1987. He's grateful for the break the Spock character gave him, the opportunities he had he wouldn't have otherwise thanks to the recognition he gained for that role, and despite the roles he couldn't land because of his reputation as a stoic and unemotional actor. But more than that, he's grateful for the opportunity to play and create a truly original, complex, challenging, and admirable character in Spock. The book isn't about his frustration with being identified with Spock, it's largely about his frustration with trying to recapture his own identity after Spock. He doesn't wish there was no Spock, he doesn't want Spock dead, but he threw himself so completely into that role. He discusses the various reactions people had on set to his largely remaining in character throughout rehearsal and shooting days, and it not only defined him for the public, it shaped him and changed his own definition of himself, which he struggles in the book to fully understand. It's an existential exploration of not one man, but two, as Nimoy sees Spock as a complex, albeit fictional, person in his own right. Nimoy has several conversations with Spock in the book about the meaning of life, whether there even is such a thing or why that's important, logic, love, etc., that are entertaining and thought-provoking, and I love that Nimoy uses this device because it illustrates how much Spock is still a part of him. There's an undeniable distinction between his voice and Spock's, but I feel like I can see the intricacies in each, where one voice has influenced the other. Leonard Nimoy is not Spock, and yet there is a lot of Spock in Nimoy. And Spock is not Nimoy, but you can see the Nimoy. You can see the attempt at suppressing Nimoy in Spock. That's his innate, uncompromising compassion that shines through no matter how he tries to hide it. Nimoy writes Spock as well or better than anyone has ever written Spock, and I could have done with a whole book of Nimoy-Spock conversations. Not instead of this, but certainly to supplement it. Nimoy and the writers of Star Trek created this person, and Nimoy has a fascinating crisis of identity, though certainly not a nuclear meltdown, which he plays out for us on the page. Nimoy is in some ways Spock's father, but then Spock's real father is Gene Roddenberry. Perhaps the two are more like Spock's parents, together. There's this great bit where he's trying to figure out what Spock's actual birthday is. But Nimoy also brings Spock to life, and after a time, one the way he is now cannot exist without the other. Spock would obviously have been someone else if even the idea of Vulcan emotional suppression had remained if someone else had played the part, and very likely wouldn't have existed beyond the original pilot. the cage, as the network wanted the character axed. Roddenberry likely wouldn't have insisted on retaining Spock if he hadn't liked the child Nimoy had helped him bring to life that he wanted so badly to nurture into adulthood. Nimoy talks about his trend of playing alienated and even unemotional characters for years before Star Trek, and so clearly there was some of Spock in him already, and there would have to be, since aspects of his personality had to seep into Spock to make him who he was. But Nimoy himself was also a different person once he came to know Spock, getting in touch with some of those aspects of his personality, bringing them deeper into focus, and living with that emotional suppression for 3 years. Nimoy taps into a universal truth about the human condition. We all wear masks. All of us pretend in order to blend in, or to get ahead, or just to survive. And the longer we wear one particular mask, the more we become, at least in part, that person. The really interesting thing for me, though, is that there had to be some of that mask inside inherently for us to so effectively start wearing it in the first place. I mean, sure, you can emulate someone you'd rather be over yourself, but to totally commit to it, to the point where you can't separate it from your chemical makeup, to care that much that it resonates with you that way, it's probably more than a mask. So whatever the given circumstance, how much of that pretending is really pretending, and how much of it is letting the real us out? I Am Not Spock is dripping from the edge of the pages with personal truth. Nimoy's writing is self-assured, light and conversational, thoughtful and academic, but also totally vulnerable. He isn't afraid of getting personal. And he's not self-indulgent or overstated, just real. In a way, it is the sort of catharsis activity I had always imagined it to be. Nimoy isn't angry, but he's also writing as much for himself as he is for the reader. It's therapeutic. I like what he says toward the end about personal writing. He finds it gratifying to take the risk of putting himself out there as opposed to hiding behind the characters he plays. That's safe. If someone doesn't like your character, he says, it's easy to blame the material because he's just a cog in the machine. But with writing, it's all you. And while that can be scary, I think Nimoy finds satisfaction in it because he's doing what good writing always does. He's landing on some sort of truth. He doesn't sit down to write this book to tell us what he's already learned about the identity of Leonard Nimoy and its relationship to the identity of Spock. He sits down to try to suss that out for himself, and he's graciously allowing the reader to go on that journey with him, always conscious that he has a passenger and making sure to include his reader rather than to drop him off at the bus stop and drive away. This passage is from the second to last page of the final chapter. You start to realize that it's okay to be out there and honest and open about yourself because you are part of the human race and other people respond the same way and have had the same feelings and are touched by it. And that gives you the courage to write some more and say some more personal things. Nimoy's philosophy about writing, as I see it on the page, is the same as his philosophy on acting. He doesn't do it because it's a job and he wants to get paid for it. He does it because he's compelled, because he has to do it for himself. Whenever he would get bored with his acting, he had to find something else to do, because the craft was more important to him than the paycheck. I like how candid he is about the money he made on Star Trek. He's not afraid to call himself a rich man. In his chapter entitled Mission to Mission, he talks about leaving Mission Impossible, which he starred in for 2 seasons right after Star Trek was canceled, in a totally unheard of sort of way. He got out of his contract, having to talk his agent into getting him off the show. It was fun for a while, he says, but he had gone from playing a fully realized person to what he calls a non-character. He got to play aspects of different characters episode to episode, got to do a lot of voices and play a lot of different stereotypes as he played a master of disguise, but there wasn't really anything to the man behind the masks, which is really interesting when compared to Spock. One mask Nimoy finds difficulty taking off. He was excited to get the chance to play different roles, and it turned out to be a be careful what you wish for situation. Now he was sort of playing a different role every episode, and it became stale for him. He wasn't developing a character with any sort of complexity. He says if he had stayed on Mission Impossible through the rest of the series, he would have gone from being a rich man to being a very rich man, and I feel like I can hear Nimoy's inflections through the pages. To him, there's no important distinction between the two. If he's not creatively satisfied, he's happy to take the hit and look for work, even if it takes a long time. At the end of the day, it's a book about what makes a man happy, and by the end, what I'm left with is the feeling that Nimoy maybe wasn't totally sure what made him happy, but discovered by the end of his writing journey what that was and that he had already attained it. I identify a lot with Nimoy in the way he approaches both art and life. He says in his final chapter that he doesn't always know what he's doing, but knows precisely why he's doing it. And sometimes it's the other way around. He knows why he's doing something, but doesn't really know what he's doing. Happiness for Nimoy is knowing both. Knowing what you're doing, being good at it, and most importantly, wanting to do it. He says a lot of people spend their time doing what they have to do and not taking the time, or perhaps they can't take the time, finding out what they want to do. And he seems incredibly grateful for the opportunity to explore what he wants to do and finding a way to make it what he has to do. When I went to college, a lot of students I knew hated their classes, even hated their majors, and just wanted to rush through and have a piece of paper that would magically give them a job they probably didn't want to do, that would hopefully allow them to maintain whatever lifestyle they hoped to live. I went to school to learn a craft. I wanted to be a writer. I wasn't naive. I knew I wouldn't leave college with a guaranteed job writing for a living, but I wanted to create, and I wanted to get good at it. And I knew I'd be a lot more unhappy with a good-paying job that didn't allow me the time to express myself creatively than I would be if I just threw myself into mastering the craft and worrying about the rest later. And that's exactly Leonard Nimoy. He was realistic, certainly. He provided for his family, and I imagine he would have done anything on the side he had to, were he not as successful before or after Star Trek. He was already an established character actor and ran his own acting studio before The Cage, but he wasn't just an actor, not just a cog in the machine. He was an artist, and without that attitude about the material, Spock could never have been born. Nimoy looks at acting as a part of the storytelling process. His character isn't the be-all, end-all product. He wants his part to be great, but he also wants the whole to become more than the sum of its parts. He has a wonderful quote on effective storytelling, one I'm likely to start using when discussing the difference between concept and execution in a scene, what a writer is telling us he's conveying versus what he's actually conveying, whether the scene has a chance at really emotionally resonating with people or not. He says, I find it very difficult to play a scene believably unless I believe the scene I'm asked to play. I was never able to lie to a girl in order to achieve a desired goal or effect. I try to keep the same faith with an audience. When an actor is out of touch with the truth in performance, either because his material has led him astray or he isn't identifying with it, an audience may not know what is wrong, but they know that something is wrong. I would recommend this book to anyone interested in getting some insight into the mind of an actor with that sort of outlook and to get a snapshot of Hollywood in the mid-60s into the early 70s. You don't need to know a lot about Star Trek, or frankly, even like it, to understand and appreciate the pros. But for Star Trek fans, Nimoy shares a lot of insight about the production of the show that I didn't know before I first read the book. There are some basic facts a Trek fan would appreciate that you still might not know before you read the book, even though it's 40 years old. And that's one of the major places where Nimoy is keeping his reader in mind, though usually being sure to keep it relevant to his discussion of his personal identity and Spock's relationship to it. He gives a detailed account of how the Spock ears were created, which matters to the narrative because they inform the public perception of Spock as well as the way Nimoy played it. He debunks the myth that Star Trek was the most expensive TV show on the air at the time. He talks about amusing problems he ran into with executives over fan mail and who was going to pay for all the supplies necessary to respond to it when Nimoy became really famous, and he expresses his disappointment with both the terrible Friday night time slot and the, in his mind, waning quality of the stories in the third season. The book includes a number of letter correspondences between Nimoy and producers, as well as a really neat one between him and Isaac Asimov, who wrote an article about why women seem to be so enamored with Spock because of how unattainable and seemingly emotionally unavailable he was. For a lot more directly transcribed letters and memos from the original series production, read the mind-bogglingly comprehensive These Are the Voyages, not to be confused with the god-awful Enterprise season finale, season volumes, written by Mark Cushman. Some of the letters here simply provide an insight into Nimoy's outlook on the series and what it should be, and his dedication to the quality of idea-driven science fiction he felt the best in a lot of early episodes were, over the Monster of the Week episodes that were just situational and plot-driven and weren't really about anything from the third season. His back and forth with the bigwig shows as a contrast between motivations of the actor struggling to help create art that was also commercial and executives who wanted to make sure that the art didn't get too expensive, regardless of and maybe even despite the art itself. The only criticism I can really lob at the memoir is that it occasionally veers out of personal but structured into stream of consciousness territory. Paragraphs don't always logically follow each other, and especially in the earliest chapters, I sometimes find myself wondering why Nimoy is telling a particular anecdote right after another one that don't really seem to go together. Sometimes that's wonderfully effective, where once I finish the story he's telling, I see exactly how they correlate. Other times, he seems to have changed the subject and without any sort of fluid transition or line break. It doesn't doesn't happen often enough to lose me, and once I've switched gears with him, I'm always interested and engaged again. I suppose the book also ends without a solid feeling of resolution. The final chapter is certainly relevant to the book, one of those I got the most out of, and everything has been leading us to who Nimoy is now as he's worked his identity crisis out on the page. But because he never refers to that relationship with Spock again, that question of, if I am not Spock, who is, it reads more like an epilogue, and it feels a little like something is missing, just in that there is a thesis, but no restatement or summation at the end, which I would have appreciated. Perhaps the question is subtly answered for us, but it feels like a chord that's not quite resolved because the question wasn't posed so subtly at the beginning. Nimoy touches on a lot of major social issues throughout the book, partly because of his discussion of Star Trek's value as a secret vehicle for social commentary, but also just because he's a passionate man writing from the heart who has opinions about things. I was especially surprised to read his response to the then recent criticism about the sometimes chauvinist portrayal of women in the original series, and how far a lot of the thinking had already progressed on gender equality by that point. He points out that Star Trek is a product of its time and written primarily by men with very 60s contemporary views on women, but that certain episodes, especially Turnabout and Schroeder, seem like pretty sexist portrayals to him even at the time. Not to mention, that particular episode is just inconsistent with everything we know about how Starfleet views women in the service in the first place. But the biggest surprise to me is a really chilling page in which 40 years ago, Leonard Nimoy describes practically the precise and disturbing social situation we see today. Not especially encouraging, given that Star Trek is a vision of a possible future in which humanity learns to tolerate differences and work together for the common good. The book is certainly an optimistic and inspiring one, but it's a little hard to digest how little things have changed now. I won't speak to any of these things in particular, but I'll let the page speak for itself. Nimoy says, "Recently I noticed that the city of Detroit has set a record of dubious distinction by going 48 hours without a homicide. Mark Twain's beloved Mississippi River is suspected of being contaminated with cancer-producing water. Food prices have skyrocketed. Young men murder their entire families for no apparent reason. Victims of terrorist attacks in the Middle East scream for revenge through desecration of the bodies of the attackers. A major military figure raises the specter of anti-Semitism, sounding very much like the fascists of the 1930s. In Vietnam, we left our bodies, our blood, and our self-respect. George Orwell's 1984 concepts of doublethink and newspeak have crept into our society. Public faith in political leaders is shattered. Science finds easier funding for destructive weapons than for cures. Who can care? Who has the stamina and the emotional fortitude to continue to hope that conditions will right themselves? Is it any wonder that millions stay home on Election Day? It might seem counter to my usual MO to read something so politically scathing, but I think it's hard to argue against the idea that at least quite a bit of what Nimoy describes there can be seen in our society today. I don't want to end things on a sour note here or to say all hope is lost, but I found that to be a really sobering page. Enough said. I Am Not Spock is one of my favorite nonfiction books. It's a fascinating character study of a man in his relationship to a character he played. Both men are different, but they both need each other. It's a wonderful experience to watch Nimoy find himself apart from Spock through his writing. He seems to gradually come alive on the page, first reading a little colder and emotionally distant like Spock, with that same entertaining, dry wit, but he becomes Leonard Nimoy by the end, a thoughtful, passionate, emotional man who sometimes wishes he could be less like Spock, sometimes more, but who allows himself to revel in life in a way Spock cannot. It's a snapshot of the man Nimoy was at that moment in time, and he generously gives himself to us, allowing us to understand and relate to him in the same way a lot of us understand and relate to Spock. It's also a short and concise book that wastes no space, and in which profound or enjoyably head-scratching thoughts can be found on each page, and it's a book I plan to go back to again. It's not an easy book to find, first printing or otherwise. There are only ever a few copies on eBay, and these days they range between $50 to $75. His follow-up, I Am Spock, is readily available for a fraction of that cost and is much longer. I remember enjoying it, but I don't think it struck the same chord with me the original did. Then again, I read it earlier in life. I hope it goes back into print one day because it's a wonderful insight into his mind and character shortly after the original series, and I'm sure not a lot of people have read it since its initial print run. Leonard Nimoy, rest in peace, and thank you for leaving so much of yourself behind for us to study, enjoy, and to be inspired by.